Joining me to share their insights on this, CNN legal analyst Shan Wu. He represented Rick Gates earlier during these proceedings. CNN's Shimon Prokopez here with me in studio. Julie Pace with the Associated Press here as well. And in New York, our legal analyst and former prosecutor, Paul Kalin. Let me bring in the attorneys first, and Shan here at the table. Take us inside your experience with this. I mean, A, what does it tell you? Is it fair? They have not said this definitively. Is it fair to assume, reasonable to assume, that if they say, what do we do if we can't reach a unanimous verdict on one count, that they're done with the other 17? Or is that just a guess?
That's a pretty good guess. It doesn't mean for sure they're done with the others, because they could have come out with a note to say we've reached a verdict on the majority of the counts. They didn't say that. But I think that's a fair assumption to make.
And so, Paul Kalin, I want to read something just came in from our team at the courthouse. Manafort's attorney, Kevin Downing, asked Judge Ellis to give the jury a new verdict form after the jury said, we will need another form, please, in their Tuesday note. Ellis said he would not. Downing said he wished jurors would be given a third option on the form, a hung jury option for each count. So take me inside. If you're the prosecutor or you're the defense lawyers and you're at this stage, what are your options and where are you powerless?
Well, I think if you're the prosecutor on this case, it certainly feels like you might be winning on 17 counts, because when a jury is sort of on that kind of roll, checking off innocent, 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 are they going to stay around and argue about one final count if they think the guy was falsely charged or improperly charged on the first 17? Usually you'd have to say no. On the other hand, if you're finding somebody guilty and they can go to jail under certain counts, you're carefully going through each count, and you would stick around and be careful on the last count. So I think probably the prosecutors are optimistic that this is going their way. Plus, there's a 90% conviction rate generally in federal jury trials. So statistically, that goes to the side of the prosecutors, obviously. This is a strange thing with the jury note, though, John. I don't know why the judge wouldn't give them a clean sheet to start out on. I mean, the original sheet, maybe they were writing what the original split was when they first started deciding about a particular count, and they just want to be kind of starting fresh. So I'm really surprised that they didn't just print up a new jury verdict sheet. But I think what the judge is thinking is he's got a verdict on 17 counts. He doesn't want to have any blank spaces that they could fill in and really set the apple cart there. So that's probably his reasoning in not giving them a fresh sheet.
And Shimon Prokopez, you've been at this since moment one, leading up to the trial, but also during the trial. Just what goes through your mind, and what information do you have that you think?
Look, I think this was much more complicated than any of us had anticipated, right? Honestly, I mean, it just seemed like there was overwhelming evidence. But these are 18 counts, some very confusing perhaps at times. Look at this jury note. I mean, they're probably confused in some ways too, but it's clear that they've made a lot of progress. We've been waiting to hear what's going on here for days. We really haven't heard where they stand, and now we know. I think, when they write a note like, and just if we cannot come to a consensus for a single count, how can we fill in the verdict sheet? So clearly either maybe they wanted the judge to take something off the verdict sheet. If that part is very confusing, and I think as Paul said, the idea that the judge wouldn't give them a new verdict sheet, I also think this judge just does not want to meddle in this deliberation. Go back, keep at it, and let's see what happens. And then he also said in court, before he sent them back in, continue to deliberate, and he did tell the court, and this was outside of the jury, that he does not intend to take a partial verdict at this point. But let's see what happens. They could come back, and then maybe he does take a partial verdict.
Not intend to take a partial verdict at this point. And let's just step back for a minute to the importance of this case. If you are Robert Mueller, the special counsel, these charges have nothing to do with President Trump's 2016 campaign. These charges have nothing to do with Russian interference in the 2016 election. There was testimony, though, however, that Rick Gates remains the star witness against Paul Manafort, remains cooperating on other matters, number one. And there was testimony that among the misdeeds, the influence peddling, if you will, that Paul Manafort was accused of doing by prosecutors was including trying to get a job in the Trump administration from a bank president with whom he was trying to get a loan, essentially trying to get a little quid pro quo.
Right. And look, to your point, I think it's really important to emphasize that while this is Robert Mueller's team that is prosecuting this case, this is not directly tied to the questions of Russian interference, nor is it tied to the questions of obstruction that we've seen really circling around Donald Trump. At the same time, the Trump team is obviously really closely watching what's going to happen here, in part for Trump's political argument, which is that the Mueller probe as a whole is a political witch hunt, that there's nothing to it. Certainly, if Manafort were to get off, that would feed into that narrative for Trump. But if Manafort doesn't get off, if he is found guilty of these charges, it will lend real credibility to the Mueller probe, that he was able to put someone who was the campaign chairman, not an insignificant player in Trump's world, on trial and get a guilty verdict. A lot of nervousness in the Trump administration, in the West Wing right now, as they wait for this.
And that nervousness exhibited by the president himself on Friday, who did something remarkable, many people would say reprehensible, when he publicly talked during jury deliberations about how he thought this was sad. That the government was putting Paul Manafort on trial, that Paul Manafort was a good man, despite Paul Manafort, from the President of the United States, described as a good man. The federal government of the same United States says that he is guilty of, at least he's accused now, and the jury's deliberating 5 counts of tax fraud, 4 counts of hiding foreign bank accounts, 9 counts of bank fraud. Shannon, if you're at this moment, we mentioned how the defense attorneys tried to get a new verdict sheet in front of the jury. Does that tell you anything about what they know, or does it just tell you that they have limited options right now and they're trying to do the best they can?
They have limited options, but that's a very smart move, actually, to ask for the new verdict sheet, particularly the idea of giving them the option on each count of hung. That's a good way to suggest something.
That was a strange request from the defense.
But
would that be typical?
But they also have no idea, right?
Very unusual. They have no idea, and I think it's a delicate moment for Ellis from the point of view of an appellate issue, because he's got a lot of conflicting requests here. Everyone on the defense side is looking for error here. So if he gives them the so-called dynamite charge that Paul had talked about, they may say he's pressuring them too much. If he doesn't give them the option for the hung, they may say you should have done that. Because as Shimon was saying, they're saying it's just they want guidance on being hung on one count. Theoretically, they could be having some dissension on other counts, too.
Paul Callahan, one more quick question here. If you, as a former prosecutor, if you're Robert Mueller and you know, A, you have another Manafort trial. B, you're under constant attack by the President of the United States. You have to decide what to do with the Papadopoulos sentencing. You have to decide what to do with the Michael Flynn sentencing. You know the other evidence that you have or don't have is still looking for. How important is it to win the first one out of the gate when you're not only in a complicated legal situation, but an incredibly complicated political mess?
It is very important, John, to win that first one because, you know, Mueller has been under constant attack by the president. I mean, the president has got a new derogatory nickname for Mueller. Every week there's a new one that's added to the list. So his credibility is on the line here, and that is so important in an investigation like this and in trials to come in the future, because a lot of times in these really complicated tax cases, paper cases, in the end, the jury, if they trust the prosecutor and they believe in the integrity of the prosecutor, when they get to a point where it's really too hard for them to understand the law or it's difficult to understand, you know, what the accountants mean with the charts that have been put up, they rely on the prosecutor and maybe come forward with a jury guilty verdict, as they do, by the way, in 90% of federal cases. So his credibility is really important, and this is the first test, the first public test of his credibility.
Going to ask our legal experts to not go terribly far from the camera. We're going to continue to track what's happening in that courthouse in Northern Virginia. We'll bring you the latest as soon as we get any update on the jury's deliberations.